excuse for inflicting that kind of suffering, that kind of cruelty on the dogs. But if we're just doing these things to animals for the sake of, because we enjoy the taste of their flesh or of their eggs, and we want to get them more cheaply than we would if we didn't do this to them, why is that better than getting pleasure from watching them fight? It's not really obvious why we should privilege things we do for the pleasures of the taste rather than things we do for the enjoyment of watching a spectator sport, whether it's dog fighting or bullfighting or something of that sort. Okay, so that really, I think, summarizes what I want to say about the ethical arguments against factory farm products. I think everything on this slide I've already said. So, as far as questions of ethics and the status of animals is concerned, I'll leave it there for now. I have some other things to go through, and the question of vegetarianism and veganism I will come to before I finish, or we'll have time for questions. But this, I think, is really, in a way, the most important of the ethical conclusions, because this affects so much of, and to some of the environmental impacts. Animal agriculture, particularly factory farming, is the major source of water pollution in this country. And water pollution is a major problem because it affects a very large proportion of our rivers. It means that rivers that people used to be able to enjoy as recreational rivers to swim in or whatever are now too polluted. And further, the pollution actually collects in the Mississippi from all of the Midwest and the South, and flows through the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, where it causes a vast dead zone, hundreds of square miles of area, in which no fish live, and which has devastated fisheries around the Gulf of Mexico and caused great loss to the fish, to the species, as well as to people who were relying on them, many of them, of course, much poorer than we are. So this is an example of the way in which factory farms typically control their manure. They just collect it in what they call a lagoon. I thought lagoons used to be those sparkling blue things around coral islands. This is basically, this is really a cesspit of manure that just sits there and may eventually be scooped out and put on fields, but the problem is that they put it on the fields too thickly because it's too costly to move far enough away, and so it still ends up running off into the rivers when it rains. Also, every now and again you get really unexpectedly heavy rain in an area, and then the lagoons may break and just all the contents empty into the rivers. That's happened in many times in many different states, killing millions of fish and sometimes spreading tens of miles downstream. This shows you just the size of some of these intensive farms. You saw the picture of the pigs inside one of these sheds, or a shed like this. Now you have a look at, each one of these is a big long shed, and here's an area that has, 9 sheds or something just here. So you can imagine the thousands of pigs confined in this area, all of their waste going into this lagoon before getting sprayed on the fields. There's another one. And this is just one little cluster of these sheds. There's another one up here. There's another lagoon with other sheds out of the picture. There's another set there. So it's a vast process with a huge amount of manure coming out of it. If it's well handled and all goes well, it could be okay from an environmental point of view, but obviously it's a problem if things do not go that well. Also, of course, they're not very pleasant neighbours when the wind is blowing from them to you, and you have a lot of people in areas, in states where there's a lot of hog farms in particular, who feel that they're places have been ruined because somebody set up a hog farm and the smell is just very strong on a day when the wind blows it your way. Okay, let's talk a bit about climate change. This is a cattle feedlot. Again, these things are very, very large. As compared to the other forms of factory farming you saw, it's not nearly as crowded. The animals do get to move around, there's bits of space, and so on. So that's better. But the problem with cattle, and particularly, well, problem with actually, as I'll say, with all kinds of cattle production is the impact on climate change, which we've become increasingly aware of. So the question that I'll raise, particularly with this one, is the fact that in order to feed these cattle, obviously they're not on grass, they're not feeding themselves from grass, we have to produce food to bring it to them. So we're growing grain on our arable land. We are then, and of course that uses quite a lot of fossil fuel because US agriculture is very mechanized. There's a lot of fuel used in sowing and harvesting and processing. Then we truck the grain to the cattle, and the cattle then eat it and get fattened from it. But cattle are not well suited to eating grain. It's not their natural diet, obviously. So they waste most of the food value of the grain. Estimates vary exactly, but something like maybe only 1/8 or 1/10 of the food value of the grain we feed to them actually comes back to us as meat. So we produce a lot more greenhouse gases than we would need to if we just ate the grain directly, or if we use the land for growing other agricultural products, beans or something, which would provide us with protein as well. We could nourish ourselves much lower on the food scale and much more efficiently if we were directly eating the grain rather than feeding it to cattle. So because of that, that's one reason why feedlot cattle contribute extensively to climate change. And as you see, we're feeding most of our grain to animals, and the 6-to-1 ratio here takes into account the fact that pigs and chickens are more efficient than cattle. So we do produce more grain. The ratio is not quite 10-to-1, but for the cattle, it is something like that. So you can't argue that this is necessary to feed the world. Some people say, well, the world is a growing population. This is actually harming our efforts to feed the world. It's forcing up grain prices. Here's a slide of how much usable protein, this protein, not food, we get per acre. And you see it's the plant foods that always come out on top, soybeans particularly if we're talking about protein, but even rice and corn, you get far more per acre than any of the animal products. The animal products start here with milk, then eggs, then meat, and then beef right down the bottom. So in terms of efficiently producing food, we would do much better to grow the food directly and eat it directly rather than cycle it through animals. And when people talk about biofuel being the cause of rising grain prices, well, biofuel is wasteful. I don't support using food to make fuel for our cars, but it's still small in proportion to the amount of grain we waste feeding to animals. As you see, we used 100 million tonnes worldwide of grain to make ethanol and 756 worldwide to feed to animals. And of that 756, maybe we got back the equivalent of 100 million or 150 million out of it. So we wasted maybe 600 million tonnes of grain by feeding it to animals, 6 times as much as we wasted by making biofuel. So this is not helping the world food crisis. It's driving prices up. Now, as far as climate change is concerned, 3 years ago now, we had this report from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization saying that livestock is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than transport worldwide. More greenhouse gas emissions than cars, trucks, buses, and planes put together.